Just one thing that I kind of think is that villains often have great style and are very visually memorable compared to some heroes. To use it in the slang of the kids these days, as they say, villains have drip. I'm sorry. I had to do that. Got the Riz.
I completely toned you out. I did not want to hear anything more after you said they got that drip. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I had to. But it is kind of true. It is kind of true.
My version, you're right. I wouldn't have used that terminology, but sure, we can go with drip.
Hello there.
Don't have a good day. Have a great day.
Talk to me, Goose.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Why so serious?
World! I could do this all day.
Are you watching closely?
Welcome, everybody, to the One Night Film Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Mossberg, and I got Will with me today. We're going to be talking about villain quotes and why we like them so much. Because, not even villain quotes, villains in general. But it started off as a villain's quotes, like, the hottest, coolest villain quotes ever. And then we were like, well, why do we like villains so much? We'll talk about that a little bit, but we'll also just get into some of the funnest, coolest quotes that we could that we could find that we like, play a little game at the end. But first, Will, why do you think that our culture is so attracted to villains and bad guys, and even as far back as Frankenstein's monster, technically not Frankenstein, but Frankenstein's monster, even kids movies like Megamind or Despicable Me, up to thinking Darth Vader's so cool, or any Sith Lord or anything like that? Why are we so drawn to them instead of being so opposed and being like, no, that's evil, it's bad, don't take part in that?
Well, I mean, that's a bit of I'd say it goes way farther back than just like Frankenstein. Obviously, there's mythologies and legends and stories and literature that pretty much throughout all of human history where evil, or at least like the villains who are evil characters, have a certain allure or attraction, or just people are interested in them. And just being interesting itself is an important quality that makes you want to learn more about it. And like if we go from even if we look into the Bible, there's the Adam and Eve tempted by the apple and the serpent, and the idea of like attraction of evil, I think is like I think the idea of the attraction of evil is a very prevalent theme within human history and the human nature itself, a part of the human condition, and it's basically just part of being human itself, that there's always something a bit alluring about doing what's wrong or just the temptations of it. So, and villains are like are characters and archetypes and ideals of different types of evil, or portrayals of evil and doing things wrong for various reasons. And so because of that, they kind of always have a certain allure, I think, in a mythological type of sense. So it goes back to forever. And of course, that's just a widespread thing that occurs in human history. So, but then of course, like there's film villains, and I'd like to hear your thoughts first, because I kind of have a couple thoughts about film villains and a lot of different reasons why people are attracted to them for a lot of different reasons, but also kind of the history of villains and who's portrayed as well as heroes. But that's maybe a topic for another episode.
Sure. I think what you said about evil being attractive is obviously true. I think that's, from a Christian perspective, you're going to get that as one of the first things you talk about. Like if you're to witness to someone, you're going to say, that you are a sinner and that you want to do the things that are evil, and not people will say, well, I'm a good person. Well, according to who? Because according to God, we're all sinners. And so, yeah, we are drawn to evil, but I think it's different than sinning. So little kids are going to want to disobey their parents. Like I remember a story of a little kid my sister and I would babysit, and the little girl was like 1.5, as like 18 months, and they had a Christmas tree up, and the rule was you don't shake the Christmas tree branch. And she waddled over and grabbed the branch, and Annika, my sister, who's been on the podcast before, she looked at her and she said, Emmy, don't shake the branch, don't do it, or whatever. And Emmy just looks, smiles, and just goes because she knows that there's joy. Her sinful nature is saying there's joy in disobeying, even if it's harmless. And of course, we don't want to encourage that in our kids, but my point is that it starts from a young age. And even when we get into characters like Gru from Despicable Me and Megamind, there's something funny about the wanting to be bad. Like those characters know that they're bad. They say the word bad or evil all the time, and so they know it's good, but they're choosing bad, and they're making that their persona. I have my own reason for why I think that we are attracted to villains over heroes sometimes, and why anti-heroes can be so fun. But also, I wanted to make it obvious that just because our sinful nature desires evil and sin, that doesn't mean it's bad for us to watch a movie about a big blue-headed alien who wants to do bad things and fight the superhero, or I'm using those two as a baseline because they're kids movies, and yet they're okay. As in, I love them. I love those movies, and I don't see anything wrong with them. But why do we even make those movies in the first place?
Yeah, and I think you kind of touched on something interesting with the superhero villain debate, because when you think about it, superheroes and supervillains are basically the ideas of archetypal heroes and villains pushed to their extreme. Literally, superheroes and supervillain. Like it's. I mean, especially if you could look into the origin of comics, like the heroes are not just heroes, they're superheroes in the sense that like their powers are more fantastic, their abilities are more fantastic, their good natures, their heroicness is more super in the sense that it's more grander, greater, bigger, and obvious. And the same thing with the villains. Their powers are greater, their powers are their abilities, their origins, and they're the idea of the mustache twirling villain, that's like an archetype that comes from that era, because it's the idea of a villain who's like cartoonishly evil. We say that as a phrase because it emerged from cartoons. So, that's actually an interesting point, because I think when you look at the development of how villains are portrayed in media, it has the origins of kind of the archetypal supervillains, of the cartoonishly evil villains, where they're the bad guys. And that's especially clear because of the Hollywood Code years, which is, I can't remember the exact date time period, but it's around like the 40s to like the late 50s, even a little bit of the 30s, where essentially there was the Hollywood and movies produced by Hollywood, which was the main film industry at the time for the world, was put under specific code regulations by the states, by the government, and essentially required them to have a certain moral attitude to all their films, where, for example, the bad guys couldn't be portrayed as like attractive or good. They always had to lose. The good guys always had to win. Things like that. And there's a lot of like certain moral cleaning up of different acts and what could and couldn't be shown, and a lot of censorship and stuff like that. And that's heavily criticized nowadays. But the idea was that at that time, people very much felt that, we should only portray evil as like something that's negative, and we don't want it, and good as like, these are the good guys, this is what we want, and a promotion of what we think is good. And obviously that's changed now. And I think that's what's interesting with film villains, is that they've become very attractive post-code era, because you have a lot of very dynamic, interesting villains that often stand out more than the heroes. And one thing that's interesting, but I kind of don't like as well in the more modern time, is how there's a lot of like blurring of the line of good versus evil, which, or the blurring of the line between a hero and a villain, especially with the rise of anti-heroes, which there's an interesting stories you can delve with that. But especially once it gets into like cartoons and kids shows, where it goes into that, it gets, I don't know, it's an interesting focus to look on, but at the same time, I think there's a bit of discernment that needs to be focused with things like that. And like, I think Despicable Me is going to be an interesting topic about that, because I've got a couple thoughts about that.
You covered a lot of ground there. I think one thing that I wanted to specifically talk about is what makes a villain bad, as in makes him evil. Like, you can have a bad villain like Madam Web, where he doesn't really have, he's just like, grr, arg.
I want the spiders, my spider.
His plan makes no sense. I think we should talk about Madam Web, even though it's really bad. I think it'd be a lot of fun to hate on it. But I think villains fall into three camps. The villain that's wrong is probably the most obvious one. The ones that are wrong are ones that just want something contrary to the superhero or the protagonist, or want something morally wrong. Usually those are the easiest to write because they're just bad for bad's sake. But also you can't go too far down that road. So I would say it's probably a spectrum, and you want to land right in the middle for a good villain. We'll talk about the others in a sec. But there's the villain that's just wrong and evil. But if you go too far and they don't have any reason for doing that, they just become generic and probably TV show level villain. Further down the line, you have a villain that probably has a sad womp womp backstory, because
the tragic backstory villain.
Yeah, the further along the spectrum is the tragic backstory villain, where it's not necessarily a sympathetic villain. We'll get to those in a second, but the villain that's just like, is probably more comic or comedy over anything. The comedy of like, somebody knocked my ice cream cone out of my hand and now I'm going to destroy the world. That still plays into the comedy, but that's just a reason that somebody can write in to be like, oh, this is why they're evil. Then further down the line, you have probably a legitimate reason that you can understand, but also you're like, okay, but that's a bit extreme to do this bad thing. Then you start getting into the better villains where you start thinking about like Killmonger from Black Panther and Thanos from Infinity War, where their desires seem correct, but their methods are wrong. With Black Panther, it's pretty hard because some people will criticize Black Panther and say, well, they fought Killmonger at the very beginning because he wanted to share the vibranium and the technology of Wakanda with the world. And then at the very end of the movie, that's just what T'Challa does. So yes, I see their point. But the reason that Killmonger's a villain is because he took it by force and wanted that by force. He came and he was a trained assassin, so he tried to kill T'Challa to take the throne, and that's why he was the bad guy. But also, it was all fair game. Like they had the fighting ritual because that's what their rules were. But people will say Killmonger's a good villain because he had good reason. Same with Thanos. He saw a problem. He had a solution to the problem. But the solution isn't moral. Like, it's the moral twist that when you get to it, their methods that are evil and not wholesome. That's when you realize, oh, you're the bad guy. Like, that's why all the Avengers went after Thanos, is because like they're like, you can't. Your ends don't justify your means. You cannot kill a bunch of people just to have world peace. That's you have that twist that you would make them a good character. That does make them a good character because they're looking at the world accurately and seeing a problem and wanting to fix it. But the way they get there is wrong. Did you have something to say about Thanos?
Well, I was just going to say, not really particularly about Thanos. I think what you're kind of identifying are villains who you agree up to a point, or you understand up to a point, where it's like for example, the tragic backstory. It's like, oh, this happened in my past, and because that's made me who I am, or that's the reason I'm doing this thing. And oftentimes the audience is like, oh, I understand that up to a point. It doesn't justify why you're doing this, but I understand why you're doing that. Or it's the, oh, I agree with this to a point, where it's like, yes, there's a problem, and I agree what you're doing up to this point, but not up to this, or you're taking it too far. And usually that's where the hero comes in, where they often have to grapple with the same issues, but take it in a more heroic light. So yeah, I think that's kind of what you're trying to find. Also, just one thing, it just reminded me, but when we watched Black Panther, one of the funniest things I ever watched from Marvel was when Killmonger said, "The sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire." And as someone who is a history major, that is hilarious, because every empire falls, and you're a bit of an idiot to think that you're just going to be able, a tiny African nation will be able to take over the entire world. But that's not the here nor there. So just a little funny thing.
I don't think he was advocating for world domination from Wakanda. I think he was just talking about how Wakandan tech should be universal and shared, and that's what he meant by the sun.
Not really. No, he was really just talking.
Whatever he said.
He wasn't really talking about like sharing technology. He was just using. He's basically just saying use the Wakandan technology and spy networks essentially to achieve like a hegemony, or at least dominance of some kind for Wakanda, where they're no longer the little guys. I mean, it's probably a bit of like Afrocentrism as in there as well, or Afro nationalism, something like that. It's actually an interesting thing you could talk about some other time, but
yeah, sure. Further down my spectrum, my thing that I just created 5 minutes ago is that further down the line, there is now no distinction between good or evil, and that's dangerous. I think this is where the anti-heroes lie. Venom, Deadpool, and others, where they're doing good, but good by what right? Good by their perspective, and bad morally. I think that's dangerous mentality to get into. But even as far as the Acolyte, the writers of the Acolyte said that they wanted to show that there is no good or evil. It's just how you use the Force, and that's absolutely wrong. George Lucas wrote the Force to be light and dark, good and evil. The dark side, Yoda says, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says it's miserable. It's where you have depression, and the light side is using it for good, and your desires are aimed towards helping others. And the Acolyte writers just said, no, it's all a big misunderstanding. It's okay to have a gray area, and the gray area is probably the hardest place to be, because then you're out of this. You feel a disconnect, because this world that we live in actually has right and wrong. And when you put yourself in a place that has relativism like that, then it doesn't, you don't connect with it because you understand that there's right or wrong here on earth. And so when you write a story that doesn't have that, there's just a disconnect that is dangerous and just doesn't work from a storytelling perspective.
And I think you just touched on the big reason why there has been such a switch in regards to anti-heroes, villains, and heroes, and like the intermingling between the two, and the death of good versus evil type of an idea, essentially. Maybe not death, but at least like the blurrings of the line that tends to be very popular nowadays. And that's essentially because like the shift in the culture itself. Media is media, and arts is how we express ourselves in culture. And so when the culture changes, the arts and the media change, although sometimes the media and the arts change, the culture as well. It's, one of those which came first type of a deal. But it's definitely true that, again, going back to kind of the history of how this develops, like in the code era of Hollywood, you have a specific censoring of what is and isn't allowed. And that's because people have a very distinctive idea of what is good and evil. And that's how we are going to portray villains and heroes. But once you get rid of that, then you also have this cultural shift after World War II and different ideas popping up. And then you eventually have like the idea of like essentially relativism, or moral relativism. And it's not like everyone in Hollywood is a moral relativist or whatever, but there's certainly in our culture a much bigger idea that, good and evil isn't so easily defined, or that it's more of a construct specifically created by institutions rather than something that's universal. And that's mostly because because of the loss of the Christian moral worldview. So if you don't believe in a God or whatever, then you don't necessarily have to believe that there is a specific moral worldview that you have to adhere to, that there is an arbiter who is beyond you or anyone else, and that who is setting down the moral laws of the universe. And so because of that, if there's no moral laws of the universe, well, then what exactly is a hero versus a villain? It's all kind of subjective, mostly speaking. Maybe this guy's actions are wrong to you, but they're not universally wrong. They're just wrong to you because of your opinions. And maybe they're right to somebody else. And it's also the idea of every villain is the hero of their own story type of an idea, which there is some truth to that, certainly. But I think that's the big reason why now you have, again, figures where there's this clash of good versus evil, versus the idea of the gray area where nobody's really good and nobody's really evil. And from a Christian worldview, it's an interesting way to look at it, because again, the world is complex and it's not quite so simple, and nobody's perfectly good and nobody's perfectly totally all the time evil unless you really, really try, which is, again, neither here nor there. So I think that's that with films and stuff, people kind of have this expectation that if it's just a hero and a villain is kind of bland and boring, and that's for children. Again, the idea of cartoonishly evil, cartoonishly good, where that's again a children's thing. That's something that doesn't actually exist in the complex, multifaceted, grim world that we live in, where everyone's kind of good and bad. And there is some truth to that, where everybody has a potential for good and evil, and most people tend to kind of just be in a bit more of a gray area than they tend to be really on one side or the other in regards to good and evil. But yeah, so overall, it's the idea that I think the moral relativism and the idea that and the kind of the loss of a specific hard set rules of what is good and evil, and how that's kind of been broken down a little bit in our culture, has definitely contributed to how villains are portrayed, and how a lot of villains, some people even think they are unironically right in many cases.
And I think you can even use where the line gets blurry idea well. I believe Captain America Civil War does this decently well. I wouldn't say it's the best of the Marvel movies. It's pretty good, especially a lot of phase 1 through 3 is even better than what we've had in 4 through 5. So I will watch Thor: The Dark World over almost anything besides No Way Home from phases 4 and 5. But my point is, Civil War actually sets up an idea and situation where they're conflicted because there is no black and white. And I think they deal with that well as a storytelling device. Not necessarily that there is a right or wrong answer, but the two sides have opinions and they're strong and fast on that. And yes, it's to give us a fight scene and have superheroes fight each other. That's the main purpose. But I still think that they led up to that well. I also think that having anti-heroes as a big form of entertainment now is dangerous, and yet it's interesting to see how much the public loves it. You have most of the Sony movies being anti-heroes. You have Morbius and Venom and Kraven's coming out later this year. I think it might be pushed to 2025, and then it'd be really funny for us in our 2025 predictions episode to have talked about it 3 different times and what we think it's going to be like, because we talked about it in 2023, 2024, and if it gets delayed again, 2025. But besides that, he's another anti-hero, and people are obsessed with that. So it's dangerous because it's so easy to just like the protagonist, and the protagonist isn't always good. I think one reason that we are attached to villains and anti-heroes is that heroes are boring. In the general sense, the heroes being boring shows that there is absolute right, because usually the correct answer to something is consistent with what is good and right and beautiful, and we attribute that to God. But they're boring because they have the same answer. It's to protect life and preserve good and preserve beauty and whatever else you want to add to a hero. Usually it's protect life. That's where superheroes come from. Protect beauty could be somebody who wants freedom to create or something. If there's like a movie about an artist or whatever, everyone can agree that what a hero does is good, whether it's desiring peace or justice or whatever. That's all good, and we get that. Good is kind of a stake in the ground, whereas evil, or whatever an anti-hero or villain does, can be twisted in many other ways and come at from a different angle. And I believe that's possibly a way that the deceiver, the fallen angel that we call Satan, he deceives. Like, that's why we call him the deceiver. And he twists so many things, and he can twist it to look good. He can make it come at you from different angles, but good is going to stand still. Good is set in stone, and it's absolute, whereas evil is going to make its way around. And so that's why I think that some people want to twist. They want that twist of where is this evil coming from? Where is this perspective of evil? Because they know what's good, even if they won't admit it. Even if they'll say truth is relative and your truth and my truth, it's still permanent. And their variety comes through the evil in different characters like that. Does that make sense?
I think what you kind of are touching on a little bit is the classic association of like order with good and chaos kind of with evil, which, I mean, there's a bit of like nuance with that, but that's kind of like a bit of a trope as well. And I mean, I think there's kind of like some truth to that as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned that heroes are boring, because like, again, in some sense, yes, heroes are kind of boring. And there's this idea of like paragon heroes, which are like noble heroes, like noblest of heroes, like Superman or Captain America, and how like, okay, they always do the right thing all the time. And I think part of the reason that might be boring is that maybe subconsciously we kind of dislike that, because we are not paragons. We're not superheroes in that sense. We're not always doing the right thing all the time with the great power that we have, which, like, you know, great power is relative, but the idea that we're not like that. And so I wonder if maybe that's part of the reason that they're boring, is that like they're just so good that like it's what's the point? We can't ever be like that. But I think that, and part of the great power of heroes is that you can see what you should be, or you can see an example of what you can try to follow, or an ideal. But I think maybe the idea that for villains, part of the reason is that there's so much variety in different ways that you can go about creatively doing evil. It reminds me of I can't remember the Bible verse, but it's in the Genesis, you know, when like right before the flood, where it talks about, you know, how humanity at that time was wicked, and like every thought of the human mind at that time was, what can I do to do evil today? Like, there's like an incredible amount of ways that humans can do terrible stuff. And it's kind of shocking and disturbing when you really think about it. And the variety of villains maybe plays into that, and the fact that villains can have so much style and character, and they're never doing good, or never trying to, generally speaking, do good. It depends on the villain, obviously. But maybe that variety also makes it so much more compelling and interesting, because they're more relatable in some sense, in the sense that, like, yes, this, like, that, like, who wouldn't want to like give in to their worst impulses? Who wouldn't want to get revenge on somebody who's wronged them? Who doesn't want to get rich or steal or lie and get themselves better along the world? And, you know, and obviously there's different extremes about that. So maybe that's an interesting reason why villains are so interesting. And just one thing that I kind of think is that villains often have great style and are very visually memorable compared to some heroes. To use it in the slang of the kids these days, as they say, like, villains have drip. I'm sorry. I had to do that. I got the Riz.
I completely toned you out. I did not want to hear anything more after you said they got that drip. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I had to. But it is kind of true. It is kind of true.
My version, you're right. I wouldn't have used that terminology, but sure, we can go with drip.
If my brother ever listens to this, I'm sorry, Warren.
I don't think he would. Sorry. He can message me if he does, and then tell me, Seth, I listened to it. Whatever. I think one reason that we might like visually, we might like villains more, is because dark is cool. And that's not, again, I'm not advocating for some abstract person who might exist who likes these things, the Deadpool fanatic, the person who whatever loves all of the violence. But I'm just saying there's some designs for villains that are really cool. Like everyone will admit Darth Vader is one of the best villains of cinema, and he has a black suit. I think it's part of it is like we like dark mode. Is that so crazy to say? Like sometimes we like the dark mode version, and I don't know. It has nothing to do with the mentality or the perspective of what Darth Vader was, but like anyone dressed in black, like even if you had Tony Stark and he took one of his, whether it's, he's got red and gold, and if like let's say he had black and gold or black and red, that would be a very cool villain type. Like I don't know what they're going to do with Doctor Doom. Maybe they'll make him, maybe for a while he'll have like a villain version of his suit, but that would be cool. And it's only because dark mode is cool to a certain generation, and that's part of the problem. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's just one possible answer.
Gotta love the edgy 90s.
Yep.
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to talk about before we started talking about our favorite villain lines, not that I know it seems wrong that we've been figuring out why we like villains so much and then we're going to talk about our favorite lines. It's padding the episode. I'll admit that. I just wanted to talk about some deeper stuff, and I think it's good. When I was talking about the blurring the line between good and evil, there's also been a push to make misunderstood villains, and that's usually retconning an old villain. Maleficent did this, Captain Hook in Wendy and Peter Pan, or Peter Pan and Wendy, whatever the live action one was, Kylo Ren. Like they're bad not just to be sympathetic but to be misunderstood, and misunderstood usually ends up meaning that the protagonist is the one in the wrong. And I don't agree with that. I don't like, take Captain Hook for example. For the live action one, they made him be one of the lost boys, or be one of the boys who ended up in Neverland. And then Captain Hook said, I actually do want to grow up. I want to go back to Earth and grow up. And Peter said, no, you can't. And basically kicked him out and shunned him. And then he turned into Captain Hook. And that doesn't seem like a hero or protagonist thing to do for Peter. And so you want to side with Captain Hook objectively because that wasn't right for Peter to do. But I don't think that should have been Captain Hook's backstory. I haven't watched Pan. I know it has Hugh Jackman in it, but I kind of wanted to see what that backstory was.
It doesn't really play into that. He's more of a crazy villain archetype in that one.
I just don't think you can give a villain a backstory and reason to do what they're doing, but you can't make them morally better than the protagonist, than the person that is either the titular character or the main good guy who's objectively good. Like Peter Pan in every other scene is fighting to protect his family, more or less. And then you can't just give him this dark side where he casts them out if they don't follow the rules of Neverland, which are, if you're in the Lost Boys, is that you can't want to grow up. I don't know. But yeah, the misunderstood one even applies to the Acolyte, where they started writing the dark side, the witches, as the misunderstood ones. They're just misunderstood and they wanted what's best. And the Jedi are bad because they're the child kidnappers and they come and take people away, or take kids away. And like,
the power of many.
No, don't bring that up. Please don't bring that up.
The power of one. Okay, the first, I haven't even watched it. I just watch all the memes about it, and it's just, I love it. Mm-hmm. I don't have to have any care about it. I just get to watch all the funny memes. Just gonna know that, okay, yeah, I guess witches are cool now in Star Wars. Sure, it's not like, and honestly, it's what I would expect from a bunch of old lesbian women who just are together in the woods. So it wouldn't surprise me if they actually did that.
I think Isaac and I are going to talk about the Acolyte sometime soon.
I'd love that.
So stay tuned for that. That's going to be fun.
I think one of the best things about villains is that they're such a good way to explore themes that are important to us and explore the avenues of evil and what causes it, and also how that changes characters. And that, because again, sometimes heroes tend to be boring, and sometimes you can have a really good story with a really good hero, and the villains often play off. They are necessary to play off against the hero and to challenge the hero and to challenge the audience perceptions on, oh, what about this, what about this, what about this. And sometimes that's I think the best example of this is the Joker versus Batman, where they're perfectly paired up against each other. Mm-hmm. And the Joker just constantly pushes the audience and Batman, and he's such a good character in that sense, in playing off against the hero. And they can be used, if used well, to explore so many valuable ideas about maybe what not to pursue, or also about the corruption of power, or how going down a good path with good intentions can lead you into darkness and stuff like that. You can do so much with villains, and they're so because of the variety, you have such a good way to explore different topics and ideas. And just one more thing is that you talked about misunderstood heroes. I think there's been a bit more of a pushback against that by audiences. And again, this goes to the whole, like, we don't want to see people as like villains or heroes. We don't want like to put people in hard boxes nowadays in our culture. You want them to think that, oh, what's their backstory? They're just misunderstood, and that type of idea. But there is more of a pushback, and I think the best example we can use is Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, where in that episode we actually talked about how the villains all portrayed the main villain archetypes, like the pure evil for evil's sake, like which is Big Boy Plum. I can't remember his name. Jack Horner. There you go. Who was like, he was great in that, and he was pure evil, and he knew it, and he didn't care. Or you have like the more sympathetic villains, and you understand kind of like where they're going for. And so I think that like, there's kind of been a bit more of a pushback against misunderstood villains, and I kind of like that a little bit, because I think that you can have sympathetic villains or villains who are a bit misunderstood, and you can do that well. But I don't like the oversaturation, and I really don't like the taking things that actually are evil and trying to portray them as good, especially with villains. And I think the most egregious example is the Satan himself, like the biblical Satan, where there's a lot of like media that portrays him as just misunderstood. Like Lucifer is a great example. And I think that's dangerous because it takes something that is evil and try and portray it as good. Another personal problem I have is with Dracula, who is one of my favorite villains of all time, and he's often portrayed as like, terrible, but at the same time, he's kind of in love and whatever. And like nobody would do that for Hitler, for example, but people are going to do that with Satan. I think that's not a good thing to do, and I kind of rubs some the wrong way, and I don't like that. So, but I'm kind of glad that there's a bit more nuance now with just having not just misunderstood heroes, but sometimes it's okay to just have the bad guys beat the bad guys.
Yeah. It's something subconscious that people can't talk about or can't bring up always, is that we know deep down what's good and evil. Like a lot of street preachers will say, well, what if I came up and punched you in the face right now? Is that wrong? And they would say, well, yeah. And it's like, well, yeah, because there's good and evil. There's right and wrong. I'm not going to punch you in the face. But that shows that you have a moral compass written on your heart. And you said something about dark and light, or something about villains paralleling the heroes, and that leads into the stereotypical quote that's like, we're not so different, you and I. When you have true goodness as your perspective, you'll know what the evil is, because you can see the shadows, because you'll know that it's not light. Like, that's the point. All right, we are going to move into our little game for the second half, and we are going to give each other movie quotes from villains that stand out for some reason or another, and we're going to see if we know them. I think you might know 80% of mine.
Okay.
I don't know which ones you picked, but also you didn't have this game in mind when you were picking yours, so I don't blame you if they're easy.
Well, I think that some of ours might overlap, knowing the two of us, especially in some areas.
Probably.
We can just do it. We can just try 11 for now and just see.
Okay.
If it goes less or more, it's just no big deal.
All right, so we're gonna do where you have to guess the character and the movie, and then we can talk about why it's such a cool line. So I can go first, and you will love this one. I know you'll love this one because I picked this one especially for you. Ready?
Yes.
Life's not fair, is it, my little friend? While some are born to feast, others spend their lives in the dark, begging for scraps. The way I see it, you and I are exactly the same. We both want to find a way out.
Ring any bells?
That is Scar from Lion King, and I am... Yes. How would I know? Because I played him. I'm assuming that's from the original, not the remake, but
No, it actually is from the remake, I think. If I can find it, I might add in your rendition of Scar if I can find the video, because I know I have it somewhere, whether it's at my parents' house or on my computer. I think I own it, and we'll insert it now. It was some good memories. It was very fun to be your Mufasa and you to be Scar. You were my Scar, I was your Mufasa.
Yes. Well,
all right, you got one?
Here's one. I'm not sure if this counts as a villain quote, because he's not really a villain when he says it, but he becomes a villain. So this gets a little complicated, but...
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
I think it's a really good quote, and it's very ironic.
Well, okay, let me guess and get it right. It's Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight. I think that's one of the most, that's probably would make a top 5 most iconic villain quotes of all time, just because it's so universal. And I think Nolan had a way with words. There's a couple other Nolan ones on here, surprisingly. But yeah, he has a way to make the villain seem real. Now, Joker was written as an insane person, and Bane kind of was bad to be bad as far as I know. But yeah, he really gave Harvey Dent a personality, which I know has probably been done in comics before, but I think that line, because it's so iconic, is just so good in how it describes his specific situation of eventually becoming the villain, but it kind of also shows the draw of the dark side, not Star Wars dark side, just evil.
It's just a really good quote, and again, it's very ironic because of the sense that he does become the villain, and that's the whole point of the quote, is that it's a bit tragic because Harvey Dent is like the White Knight. He is the good guy who becomes essentially not corrupted, but like destroyed on a character level and becomes something different that's totally opposite of what he was. And he lives long enough to become the villain. So
yeah. All right, my next one.
I'll sell my invention so that everyone can be superheroes. Everyone can be super. And when everyone's super, no one will be.
That is Syndrome from The Incredibles.
Got it. Man, these are so easy. Not that they're supposed to be hard. Yeah, Syndrome. He is kind of a cheesy villain because he was like, oh, Mr. Incredible, you didn't like me as a kid, and now I'm going to kill your family. Oh, no. But his perspective on it is still good, I believe, when he's making everybody, he's saying that superheroes stand out because they're abnormal and they're super. But if everybody's on their level, or if superheroes are brought down to everyone else's level, then nobody is special. And even though that's a very communistic mindset of like, everyone else is going to be equal except for me, and I'm going to be more superior. Like, what's the phrase? Everyone's equal except for those who are more equal.
No. It's everyone is equal, but some are more equal.
More equal than others. Yep. So that's Syndrome's mindset, is that everyone is going to be equal, even if they're all super, but then he's going to be more equal. He has an ego problem is the situation. But yeah, that's why I like that one.
All right. Here is another one from me. I'm going to go with, I think you should be able to get this. It might take, it's a bit more obscure, but I'm fairly certain you've watched this film, because I don't know why you wouldn't have, because of the franchise. So
give it to me.
People think in terms of good and evil when really time is the true enemy of us all. Time kills everything.
I'll give you a hint. It's in Marvel.
That sounds... Well, now I want to say Doctor Strange, or is it the Doctor Strange villain? I actually forgot his name, but that's only because he has the time stone.
Yeah, yep. So it's Caecilius? Yeah, from Doctor Strange. So that's basically like his whole point is like he wants to use the time stone to like, because that's the true evil and that's such an enemy. So it's like, I think it's an interesting quote, especially because Doctor Strange uses the time stone to achieve victory, and the idea of like time as being the enemy of everyone, like that's what ultimately wears everything down and kills everyone. And like the fear of death is very prevalent across cultures, and it's often what motivates a lot of villains, either to bring back a loved one that died, or to try to stall death and not be killed, or to avoid a prophecy about someone killing them. So I think that kind of speaks about a very universal fear of death, and because of the fear of time, because time kills everything.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I don't think that's iconic, but it's true. Like, I understand why you picked it, but I think Caecilius kind of gets lost among all of the Marvel villains. But it's a good pick. I like the truth behind it. All right, my next one, from, weirdly enough, one of my favorite movies, but mostly because of how it looks and not the idea of it. But you'll guess it here in a second.
You want to protect the world, but you don't want it to change. How is humanity saved if it's not allowed to evolve?
That is Ultron from Age of Ultron.
Ultron from Age of Ultron. If you say Ultron, Age of Ultron, it sounds like Bond, James Bond.
James Bond.
Yeah, I think James Spader did a really great job voicing Ultron. In fact, some people knew James Spader from The Office before he was in Ultron. And I knew him from Ultron before I watched The Office, and so it was very funny to have that flip-flopped. But he has a great voice for it, and I think Ultron's perspective on the world is still wrong. Obviously, I think he falls into the understandable villains because he's a robot. He doesn't technically have feelings. He's a second Jarvis created from the Mind Stone. But he has a different perspective, and he's like, humans are the problem, and so we'll get rid of them all. Again, it's not a flawless story, but I like the look of Age of Ultron, and I like Ultron as a character. And yeah, he's got some zingers in there. So back to you in the booth, Will.
There's so many for this one I can do, but because we're gonna do quotes, I'll just do this one. So because I really like it, I think it's kind of funny from on a couple of different levels. So
if you're good at something, never do it for free.
Yeah, that is Joker from The Dark Knight.
And I like this one because, firstly, it's such like a thing that like Joker uses like something that makes common sense well in a non-commonsensical situation, which is the situation like where he's like, you know, I'm gonna kill the Batman, and it's like oh, okay, you're a clown who's just walking to a group of kingpins and saying you're gonna be able to, you're the one who can kill the Batman, and you expect to be paid to do that. So I kind of like that. At the same time, it's also like, you know, it hits the true capitalist in my heart where it's like, yes, you know, I'm an entrepreneur, so you know, I have skills and I can actually employ those in a market economy where I am of benefit, and both the market and myself will be of benefit to this. So I find it funny on a couple of different levels, which is ironic because it's the Joker. He's not supposed to be funny, even though he's supposed to be funny. So
yeah, I get it. All right, here's one that hits hard only because it has context of more movies down the road.
If you can make God bleed, then people will cease to believe in him.
I want to say that's a Marvel one, but it doesn't immediately. It sounds familiar, but it doesn't sound immediately familiar. Although that kind of sounds like a Nolan film type of quote as well.
I thought I would have given it away with my little hint there. It's one of Josh's favorite callbacks. I didn't think I'd stump you with this one, but I can just tell you.
Well, good. When you said the bleeding thing, I was thinking of like Thanos, all that for a single drop of blood, but no, it's not that one. I'm getting it, but I'm not quite getting it.
Okay. I'm not going to hold it over you if you can't get it. I can just tell you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't quite place this one.
It's fine. Ivan Vanko from Iron Man 2. And it is Thanos in a sense, because that's the callback. Is that when Tony made Thanos bleed.
Oh, okay. That's why I don't know that one, because I don't know if I've watched Iron Man 2.
Oh,
nope.
wow.
Nope.
Okay.
I have. That's just been a long time. That's probably like one that's probably one like the least noticed, which is probably why I don't remember. That's a good one though.
Again, there's two parts to this. Thanos at the end of time, or at the end of the Endgame, or at the end of Infinity War, when Tony actually makes him bleed, and that shows that he can be defeated. That's the point of that scene, and it's a great callback. The biblical perspective is that people did make God bleed, and yet he didn't stay bleeding or stay dead. It would have been true that people should not believe in Jesus if he just bled and then never rose from the dead. But he did rise from the dead, and that made him that made it null. That disqualified the whole saying because he is God and he has power over death. But the idea in getting Jesus to the cross from the Romans and from the Pharisees' perspective is, yes, if you can make him bleed, people will cease to believe in him. Like, they knew that Jesus was claiming to be God, but not only did they want to get him out of the way, but they also wanted to prove that he's man and therefore could be killed. And yes, he could be killed because he was fully man, but he's also fully God, and so therefore he comes back to life. And that's the hope that we have. I think that's great, and I think it's a cool line.
Mm-hmm.
All
right. Let's see. I think I'm going to go with. You should probably get this one, and it's. As far as I'm aware, this is a historical quote, which is somebody actually said it, but it is said in a film.
Amateurs seek the sun, get eaten. Power stays in the shadows.
I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I do not know this one.
Okay,
I don't think I've ever seen it. Whatever movie it is.
I think you might recognize. I thought you might recognize it. Maybe not. Okay, so this is from Louis Strauss, who is a senator in Oppenheimer. So do you know the main guy who didn't like Oppenheimer in the film? He's the one who said this, and it's a very, I think, poignant quote about power. And because Louis Strauss is a real person, say historical quote because of that. But again, it's talking about like, you know, amateurs. They just want to get the fame and the glitz and the glitz and the glamour, and they want to be known. True power stays in the shadows, which is interesting coming from a politician in America and about, you know, power itself and that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, it's I think it's a very poignant quote about the truth of power and people who actually understand how to wield it or how they believe it should be used to be most effective to get what you want.
Yep. That is a good one, and I didn't remember it because I've only seen Oppenheimer once. So this one is it gives it away. Maybe you've seen it, maybe not, but even still, see if you can guess it.
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line. That's why we're going back.
So after saying it about 4 times, I think you can probably guess what this quote is about.
This is a Hopper from A Bug's Life, who I'd say that has probably gotten a reckoning of sorts in popular culture for his villainry. And yeah, that's a good quote because, you know, it's like, yeah, it's kind of true. And it's especially with how he's defeated by one ant and then all of them.
Yeah. But also, I think people have pointed to it as he's the politician of the Bug's Life. I mean, it is pretty much politics of one colony versus another, but he's telling his minions that they can't back down and they can't let the ants even get one foothold before the grasshoppers come after them. Like, he gets it. He understands it. He sees the bigger picture. So yeah, I think that's cool.
All right. This one's a little interesting. Well, actually, no. No, this one you're going to get it immediately.
I am the Senate.
Yes, it's iconic. Why is it so good? It's Emperor Palpatine from one of the Star Wars movies. I don't know which one. Is it Revenge of the Sith specifically?
Yes, it's the Revenge of the Sith. Yes, that one. So I like this one because it fully exemplifies Palpatine's character where he's like, I am the Senate. Like, you can't go against me. You're going against like the entire state itself because the state and I are one in that sort of sense. And it's like, I have all the power here. And I love that because where it's like he finally lets the mask drop. And for me, I watched Star Wars in a chronological order. I think. Yes, I watched Star Wars in a chronological order. And so I didn't actually know that Palpatine was going to be the Emperor. And so the revelation that he was the one leading both the rebellion, or the Confederation, the Confederacy, the Separatists, and the Republic was like, oh, he's a genius. He's playing both sides just for his own power. And so that scene where he's like, I am the Senate. Like, I have gathered. It's also him saying, like, I've gathered all the power around me into myself through the emergency powers and gathering people to my side. And, like, there's literally nothing you can do. And then he demolishes all the Jedi immediately. But I just really like the quote because it's like, you know, this is who I am. I am all powerful and I'm going to destroy you guys because, like, you can't go against me. And then he uses that also to you know, the event itself to gain prestige among the Senate itself.
Unlimited power, as some may say. Okay.
Don't talk like one of them. You're not. Even if you'd like to be. To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. But when they don't, they'll cast you out. Like a leper. See, their morals, their code. It's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
There's so many good ones in that one, but that is the Joker from The Dark Knight. And
I know. I had to space it out from a little bit from when you gave your other one.
Yeah, that's why I figured that we were going to have a couple of Joker ones. So I was like, I was kind of choosing some other ones besides that because there's just so many he has. And yeah, that's a really good quote though.
Well, yeah, his point is that people just put on a show and that they will do wrong. That's the two boats situation that he sets up, is that they will be all about survival and they will basically become feral and be able to make decisions about other people's lives at that point. And it's scary when he says, I'm not a monster, I'm just ahead of the curve, because a lot of what evil will disguise itself as is progressive thinking and thinking of what could be next and what can be better. And that's what Joker kind of shows himself as. Is he thinks this is the way the world should be, and I'm going to make it that way. I'm going to take it into my own hands. And that shouldn't be our goal, I guess.
This one I'm kind of split, partly because the one I really want to say I think that isn't technically from a movie, so but I'm like 90% sure that you're not going to get the other one though, which is from a movie. I'll do it. So here's a really good, and you probably have heard the quote. I don't know if you know where it's from though.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Oh, I've heard that one. I know I've heard that one. I don't know where. But you said it's not from a movie?
That one is from the movie.
That one is from a movie. The greatest trick that ever pulled was making people think he didn't exist. I'm going to really kick myself when you tell me what it's from.
I don't really know, because I didn't really hear about this one until I kind of dug into it a little bit. So it's said by Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects. And there's like a
then I feel like
quote.
it's not original.
No, because I'm that's where it originated from, or at least that's because that's like the 1995 one.
No, you're right.
Yeah, and I think it's
you're very right. I'm looking at it now,
and it's become such like a good quote that it's like used beyond that context and kind of grown beyond the movie. But
sure,
it's so good because it's speaking to the fact, and obviously like there's like the character isn't necessarily literally saying that, but he's talking about something else. But it's the idea that, you know, if you aren't known, well, like, then who's going to stop you? You can't kill something you don't know exists if you don't believe in it. And especially as Christians, I think it's a very interesting and probably more accurate type of an idea for the devil himself, where it's like, you know, if you don't believe the devil exists, you're not going to be fighting against him. If you don't feel threatened, then why should you do anything to, you know, go against the devil if you don't think he exists and stuff like that? So again, I think it's a very interesting quote, especially in a Christian context and how it's used. The other one I was going to use was just the Satan's quote from Paradise Lost, which is better to rule in heaven than reign, better to reign in hell than rule in heaven. But
yeah, I like the previous one. I've never seen that movie, which is making me wonder where I've heard it before. But I think it was similar to what Josh and I were talking about like 2 weeks ago about horror movies and how, or maybe I remember hearing it from Deacon's Is Horror Biblical episode. But Josh and I kind of talked about a similar thing where the devil likes to hide in places where you don't expect. Like the horror movies are where it's obvious that it's evil, and usually there's a objectively good counter, usually a spiritual priest or pastor or something that counters the spiritual horror. I've also been down a rabbit hole about UFOs and how that relates to the spiritual world and things like that. It's actually very interesting because some people have had experiences, and I'm more or less convinced that UFOs are demons or angels in the spiritual realm that we get a glimpse of. And one of the reasons that we don't see a lot of that is because Satan, well, one, God wants to hide it from us because it's not our time to know it yet, but sometimes we see glimpses of Satan's side because he's sloppy and he doesn't want people to believe that he exists. So every once in a while he actually messes up and you see something, UFO or ghost or whatever.
You heard it here, folks. Seth believes the UFOs are real.
I do, not in the way that people think, but no, I do think that, I don't think that they're all hallucinations, but yeah, it could be an episode in and of itself. But yeah, the quote itself has great significance, I think. Very good. All right. My last quote, I don't know that you're going to get because I doubt you've watched this movie, but I've watched it. I don't know if I'm going to do an episode on it because it's a very intense movie, but it's a thought-provoking one. And the quote that sums it up.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common. It's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night. Well, not anymore. I'm setting the example. And what I've done is going to be puzzled over and studied and followed forever.
That does sound familiar, but like it's, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I know that one. It does sound kind of familiar.
Mm-hmm. It's from John Doe from Seven, and Seven is an intense movie to watch. It's the biggest thriller I've seen. It's about a serial killer who has a pattern, and the detectives are trying to figure out his pattern. And I'll spoil the movie because it's one that I can't really recommend. So if you plan on seeing it, jump ahead, but for those of you who have a weak stomach, John Doe, who is the killer, has been murdering people by the 7 deadly sins. Like, one of his first victims is gluttony, and it's a very obese man who he continues to feed until he doesn't have any more room left. And it's very gruesome and again, not an easy watch, but when you get to the end, John Doe is explaining his master plan, and he's talking about how, yes, he's delusional, and he says that he was called by God to make these people pay for their sins. But his point in this quote still stands. We see a deadly sin on every street corner and we just wave it by. Like, why are we doing that? Why aren't we telling people their sin that they're in and telling them that it's hurting them? And so it's brutally honest, and yet, again, it's one of those where it's like, well, you don't have to kill the people to make a point. You could be nice to them, but it's still a profound quote, I think. And when you have the whole movie behind you and you get to this point in the movie, it's ramped up and you feel it. And like the first time I watched it, I was like, it's kind of profound. And even as a villain, he gets good and evil. He understands that. So I don't know. That's all I got.
Yeah. I mean, and there's so many that we can go, and that's like, again, you know, for you guys watching this, and tell us what your favorite villain quote is, and like, and why, and why it's stuck with you, or why you think it's interesting, or what it says about the villains, or the movie, or the theme of it, or just something like that. And because there's so many that you can go down, and this is just a couple of them. And I think that it's often said, like, behind, like, every hero needs a great villain, and sometimes like villains are more memorable than the heroes. And there's just so much and so many good villains, good in the sense that they are not good themselves, but they are such compelling and interesting characters that you want to learn more about them.
Yeah. No, I know you had more quotes to go. So once this episode goes out, feel free to share those in the Discord. And if you listener or watcher or whatever you're doing, if you want to drop your favorite villain quote in the Discord, we would love to talk about it, why it's meaningful or why it's iconic. Like, even just, I didn't purposefully omit Luke, I am your father. That's iconic because it's a plot twist of the century, but it's iconic in a different way. It doesn't really have meaning, but it was still very cool, and we can talk about that stuff. So if you liked it, please let us know on our Discord. Again, share your favorite villain quote on Discord and we can talk about it. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and maybe Facebook if you're that type of person. And make sure you stay tuned next week for another cool episode. Until then, know that you're loved. God bless.
See ya.